60 years ago, a man stood before a crowded room in New York City and said something that the entire Western world desperately wanted to ignore. He wasn't talking about voting rights. He wasn't talking about sit-ins or marches or the slow, grinding work of integration. He was talking about something bigger, something that made the FBI nervous, something that made powerful men in Washington lean forward in their chairs and start writing memos. He was talking about Africa, and the man speaking was Malcolm X. In 1964, Malcolm X did something that changed him forever. He left America. He traveled across Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Egypt, Tanzania, and he sat with the leaders of the African liberation movement. He listened. He watched. And somewhere between Accra and Cairo, he had a realization that would define the final chapter of his life. The struggle of black people in America and the struggle of African people against colonialism were not two separate fights. They were the same fight, same enemy, same system, different battlefield. When he came back to America, he said this, and I want you to hear every single word. The day that Africa is truly free, the black man in America will be free. He said that in 1964. 60 years later, a 36-year-old soldier in West Africa is doing exactly what Malcolm X described, and the Western world is panicking. His name is Ibrahim Traoré, and if you don't know that name yet, by the end of this video, you will never forget it. But before we talk about Traoré, we need to talk about something that most people in America have never been taught. Well, it's something that happens every single day on the African continent and directly affects the economic position of black people everywhere in the world. Let's talk about Burkina Faso. On paper, Burkina Faso is one of the poorest countries in the world. Per capita income under $700 a year. High infant mortality. Limited access to clean water. The kind of statistics that make Western aid organizations write glossy brochures about how Africa needs saving. But here is what those brochures never mention. Beneath the soil of Burkina Faso lies one of the most significant gold reserves in all of West Africa. Billions of dollars worth of gold. Gold that has been extracted, processed, and shipped out of the country for decades. Gold that built offices in Paris and London and Toronto. A gold that funded comfortable retirements for executives who never spent a single night in Ouagadougou. And the people of Burkina Faso? The people living directly above those gold deposits? They stayed poor. Generation after generation, decade after decade. The ground beneath their feet held enormous wealth, and they received almost none of it. French companies took the contracts. French military bases provided the security. French-aligned governments made sure the arrangement stayed in place. And a French-controlled currency called the CFA franc ensured that even the money circulating in Burkina Faso ultimately answered to a central bank in Paris. Malcolm X had a name for this arrangement. He called it colonialism without a colonial flag. The flag comes down, the soldiers come home, but the extraction never stops. While the suits replace the uniforms, the boardrooms replace the government offices, but the fundamental relationship stays exactly the same. Africa produces the wealth. The West consumes it. He said that in 1964. He said it so clearly and so loudly that powerful people decided he needed to be silenced. FBI files declassified decades later showed that the United States government was deeply alarmed by Malcolm X's connections to African liberation leaders. Because a unified movement, Black Americans linking arms with Africans fighting for economic sovereignty, was considered one of the most dangerous possibilities in the world. 1 year after his trip to Africa, Malcolm X was assassinated. 1 year. Now let's talk about what happened in Burkina Faso in September 2022. Ibrahim Traoré was 34 years old, but he was a military officer who had watched his country deteriorate for years. He had watched a jihadist insurgency tear through the northern regions, while the government in the capital seemed more concerned with maintaining good relations with Paris than protecting its own people. He had watched young men and women die in villages, while French military advisors sat in air-conditioned offices. He had watched the wealth of his nation flow outward while his people went without. And he decided that enough was enough. What happened next shocked the world. Traoré led a military takeover that removed the existing government. And within weeks, he began doing something that no leader in the region had dared to do in decades. He started dismantling the system that Malcolm X had described 60 years earlier. First, and he told the French military to leave, not in diplomatic language, not through back-channel negotiations. He told them directly and publicly that their presence on Burkinabe soil was over. The French soldiers who had been stationed there for years, theoretically to fight terrorism, but practically to protect French interests, packed their bags and left. The reaction from Western media was immediate and predictable. Headlines called it a threat to regional stability. Analysts warned of a security vacuum. French officials expressed deep concern. The language was careful and bureaucratic, but the message underneath was clear. How dare he? Traoré was not finished. He began renegotiating mining contracts, and he announced that foreign companies operating in Burkina Faso would no longer receive the sweetheart deals that had defined the relationship for decades. Burkina Faso would receive a majority stake in the profits from its own resources. The gold in Burkinabe ground would benefit Burkinabe people. The idea was not complicated. It was not radical. It was the most basic principle of sovereignty. And in the context of West Africa's relationship with the former colonial powers, it was revolutionary. He then turned to the question of the CFA franc. The currency that 14 West African nations use, the currency that is controlled not by any African institution, but by the French treasury. The currency that means, in practical terms, that France has veto power over the monetary policy of sovereign African nations. Traoré began speaking openly about the need to end this arrangement. He said what many had thought, but few had dared to say aloud, that a country cannot truly be free when it does not control its own money. Malcolm X, 60 years earlier, had described this exact dynamic. He had explained to audiences in New York and Detroit that political independence without economic independence was theater, that raising a new flag over the same old system was not liberation, that true freedom required controlling your resources, your currency, your economic relationships. Traoré had clearly read the same texts. Now I need to speak directly to Black America for a moment, because I know some of you are watching this and thinking, this is happening in Africa. What does this have to do with me sitting here in Atlanta or Chicago or Los Angeles? And that is exactly the question Malcolm X spent the last years of his life answering. He said this: when African people control their own resources, the economic power that flows from that control will change the position of Black people everywhere in the world. Think about what that means in concrete terms. Every year, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of resources leave the African continent and flow into the treasuries of Western corporations and Western governments. Every year, for decades. That is not money that was generated somewhere else and brought to Africa. That is money generated by African land, African labor, and African minerals that is systematically redirected away from African people. Now think about what that wealth, retained and reinvested on the continent, would mean. Schools built, hospitals funded, and infrastructure created. Jobs generated for the hundreds of millions of young Africans who currently see no future at home and risk their lives crossing the Mediterranean to reach Europe. An African middle class with purchasing power. African universities producing African graduates who stay in Africa. An African technological sector. African financial institutions. African geopolitical leverage. And when Africa has that economic foundation, when African nations can negotiate from strength rather than desperation, the entire global conversation about race and power shifts. Malcolm X understood this not as sentiment, but as strategy. He understood that the liberation of Black people in America was connected to the liberation of African people on the continent, not through culture or emotion alone, but through economics and geopolitics. When a powerful Africa changes the terms of the negotiation for Black people everywhere. That is why his trips to Africa terrified the American government. That is why his meetings with Kwame Nkrumah and other African leaders were monitored and documented. Because a man who could successfully bridge the African-American struggle with the African sovereignty movement represented a threat that went far beyond anything a domestic civil rights campaign could produce. Here is what makes this moment so extraordinary. Traoré is not operating in isolation. In neighboring Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta has made similar moves against French military presence and French-aligned institutions. In Niger, the military government that came to power in 2023 expelled French forces and began renegotiating uranium contracts. 3 countries, 3 leaders, all within the same region, all moving in the same direction at the same time. The Western media calls this the Sahel crisis. They frame it as instability, as a breakdown of democratic norms, as a dangerous alignment with Russia. They use every available rhetorical tool to describe what is happening as a problem rather than a solution. But look at what is actually happening beneath that framing. 3 nations are simultaneously attempting to end the same extraction system that has been in place since formal colonialism ended. 3 nations are simultaneously demanding economic sovereignty over their own resources. 3 nations are simultaneously saying to the former colonial powers, the old arrangement is finished. Malcolm X did not live to see this. He was killed before he could build the bridges he envisioned, but the framework he laid out, the analysis he developed in those final years of his life, the understanding that African liberation and Black American liberation were inseparable. That framework is playing out in real time on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. I want to be honest with you about something. Traoré is not a perfect figure. No leader is. The situation in Burkina Faso is complicated. The jihadist insurgency in the north is real, and it has cost thousands of lives. The governance challenges facing the country are enormous. There are legitimate questions about civil liberties and press freedom under military rule. Anyone who tells you this is a simple story is not being fully honest with you. But here is what is also true. What the system that existed before Traoré was not a democracy delivering justice to the people of Burkina Faso. It was a managed arrangement that served external interests while a population of 23 million people remained among the poorest on earth despite sitting on significant natural wealth. Whatever its imperfections, what Traoré is attempting, returning economic sovereignty to his people, is exactly what every major African and African-American thinker of the 20th century said needed to happen. Marcus Garvey said it. W.E.B. Du Bois said it. Kwame Nkrumah said it. Thomas Sankara, Traoré's own predecessor, who was assassinated in 1987, said it and paid with his life. And Malcolm X said it louder and clearer than almost anyone in the final years before he too was taken. The question that history keeps asking is simple. What happens when an African leader actually tries to do it? This is why the story of Ibrahim Traoré is not a foreign policy story. It is not a story for international relations experts or Africa specialists or people who follow geopolitics as a hobby. This is our story. The wealth that was taken from the African continent over the past 5 centuries did not disappear into some neutral void. It built the economies that enslaved black people depended on. It funded the industrial revolutions that created the modern wealth gap between the global North and South. It established financial systems and international institutions that continue to structure global inequality today. When an African leader stands up and says this system ends here, that moment has a direct line back to every speech Malcolm X ever gave and every march that ever happened on American soil. Every conversation about reparations and equity and the long shadow of slavery and colonialism. Malcolm X told us 60 years ago that these struggles were connected. He told us that you could not understand what was happening to black people in America without understanding what was happening to African people on the continent. He told us to look at the whole world. Most people did not listen. But Ibrahim Traoré was listening. And what he is doing in Burkina Faso right now, however it ultimately unfolds, whatever obstacles lie ahead, whatever forces are already working against him, is the most direct attempt in decades to do exactly what Malcolm X said needed to be done. Take back the land, control the resources, break the financial chains, or build something that belongs to the people who live there. 60 years apart. Same mission, same enemy, same stakes. The only question left is whether we are paying attention this time.